Alrighty, well, thank you everyone for joining. We're going to get started. Welcome to today's panel on Hackers Without Borders. First, I'd like to thank Todd, who has invited me to speak again at the Life Summit for AILA. I'm really excited to be here because last year my colleague Nardo and I enjoyed facilitating the Life Summit, and we convened a large group of strangers in person at Caltech to crowdsource solutions to complex healthcare problems. But unfortunately today, we can't meet in person because of COVID. We're excited to showcase several organizations that are doing amazing work globally based on crowdsourced efforts from volunteers. So for today's slides, if any of you want to maximize the slides, you can feel free to double click on the slides to make them bigger. Now, before we get started, I'd like to know who's here today, who's joining us in the room. So if you could each just type into the chat which category you consider yourself in. And I'm sure many of you span several different categories. So if you could just let us know, what's your main area of expertise, whether it's AI or other types of technology, design, clinical medicine, science research, business management, or investment. Great, so we have a mix of people here, including AI, ML, cancer research, design and data science, pharma, business and investment, organizational transformation, lots of really relevant areas to what we're going to be talking about today. And for those of you who just arrived, feel free to just jot down into the chat what your main area of expertise is. So with that, I'd like to start off with just an overview of today's session. First, I'm going to introduce myself, and then each of the panelists will be giving an overview of their respective organizations. And then we're going to have a panel discussion and audience Q&A. And we really want this to be an interactive session. So please, just if you think of any comments or any questions, feel free to put that into the chat box as we're going through the different topics. So first, I'd like to introduce myself. My name is Dombrowski, and I'm a physician informaticist and AI ethicist. And I'd like to give you a little bit of my background just so you can know what perspective I'm coming from for today's discussion. I previously worked in corporate healthcare as the Chief Medical Information Officer and lead technologist on strategy and innovation in large healthcare systems. And I've also worked with a number of different startups in health tech. And personally, my passion is really to connect needs with resources, and that could be anything from working at the corporate level to startups, as well as having helped plan and execute a number of different hackathons and crowdsource initiatives. Some of the areas where I've done this for is in past emergencies and disasters response. And a related area to disasters is the aftercare of disasters, beyond just like the physical, tangible logistics. How do you help people with healing their emotional wounds and rebuilding their life? So with that, I'd like to just start off, just as a framing exercise for our session, I'd like to start off with just a very brief activity for all of us to kind of settle in and get prepared for the wonderful presentations we have from our panelists. So first, I'd like all of you to just kind of take a deep breath and just let out a sigh. Because this year with COVID-19, we've all had such difficult transitions and transformations in our lives. And the challenges during the pandemic have not just been medical and biological, but also social, political, and psychological. So in these strange times, all of us have had some loss or discouragement. And for some of us, it's been isolating, with physical distancing, closed schools, restaurants. And for some of us, it's been financially challenging, with changes in work and changes in roles. And for some of us, it's been debilitating, whether it's getting sick from COVID or other illnesses, or just feeling emotionally overwhelmed. And then for some of us, it's been a learning curve, trying to navigate all these online meetings, learning new ways to communicate, and adjusting to the new normal. So before we have the next set of presenters talk, I'd like to just do a brief personal reflection and ask each of you, how has this year been for you? And what have you lost? And what have you gained? I'd like you to just take a moment and think about this on your own, and feel free to jot it down in your own notes. We won't be sharing about your personal reflections in today's session, but hold on to those in your thoughts and in your notes, because there will be opportunities to share about this later today. So thanks for taking the time to just pause for a moment to think about how the pandemic and all the different changes in the world has affected you today. And I hope that helps level set some of the conversations we'll be having next. And I just want to remind everyone that today's session is interactive, so please feel free to jot down your questions and your comments in the chat. And next up, we're going to have Freddie share about his organization, what they're doing, and the exciting things that they're trying to solve. So with that, I'm going to unshare my screen and turn it over to
him. Thanks, Wen, and thanks to Todd for this invitation for this panel. So my name is Freddie Nguyen. I am a postdoctoral fellow at MIT. And let's see if I can share the right screen here. 1 second. And I'm a resident physician at Mount Sinai Hospital in New York. And through my role at MIT over the last few years, I've been involved with a group called MIT Hacking Medicine. And then more recently, about 6 months ago, launched the MIT COVID-19 challenge. And sorry, 1 second here. Now I'll share the right screen. I'm not quite sure how to get it to share the right screen.
Oh, it's perfect. It's good. It's good now. Yep. And just a reminder to the audience, you can make the slides bigger by double clicking it.
So as part of MIT Hacking Medicine over the years, some of the things that at least the hackathons that we've done through MIT have really focused on 4 areas that really differentiates us from perhaps the typical software development hackathon that you see out there. One is that it's not purely focused on just coding, and it's really meant about bringing together very interdisciplinary, multidisciplinary teams. So the diversity of people that we bring together as part of either the participants, the mentors, the judges, the partners that are involved really covers the entire healthcare space. Everybody from clinicians to scientists to engineers to programmers to user designers to patients, payers, business. The second component is the design methodology process that we take, really to help teams really focus on actual problems being faced by real users and real patients out there. The third part is the viability of the idea. So it's not just good enough to have a good idea, but it's got to be a good idea that can be implemented and be feasible within the context that's going to be implemented, whether that's from an infrastructure or clinical workflow perspective, or whether that's going to also be from a financial perspective as well. The fourth part is the community that we're striving to build as well as part of our events. And it's really focused on knowing that as much as we want every single idea that comes out of a hackathon to be successful and continue to have long-term traction, we really know that that's not going to be realistic. But we hope that we've at least been able to show people and empower people about problem solving in this space, about meeting other people that have a shared interest in innovating in this space. And perhaps when they meet their next problem that they really do want to tackle, we'll now have both not just the skills and tool set, but also the community of people that can help them in that process. So for us at MIT, hacking isn't about gaining unauthorized access or breaking into systems, but really a creative application of ingenuity. And as I mentioned, there's really 4 main reasons that our hackathons really differentiate from the others. One is that there's not a need to code, highly interdisciplinary process. Again, very problem-centered work focusing on real user needs. And of course, that feasibility or business viability are integral as well. And so for us, we spent about a third of the weekend identifying the problem, breaking that down, then brainstorming solutions around it, and then through the hundreds of mentors that we usually bring at our hackathons, continue to work with the teams to iterate and improve on the solutions, ending into final presentations on the Sunday evening. The COVID-19 challenge was a bit different because this was our first foray in terms of pivoting from live hackathons into the virtual environment, just like everybody else has been as well. And of course, this being focused towards COVID-19, we decided from the get-go that we want this to be a series of virtual hackathons that were going to be hyper-focused on the problems of now and then, hoping that the problems of today are not the same problems 2 months from now, and readily recognizing the problems 2 months from now may not even be on our radar today. So as part of that strategy, we also formed a really large ecosystem of partnerships that can essentially be ready to mobilize to help teams post-hackathon, but also help us in sourcing the problems and identifying the participants and mentors and judges and resources during the hackathon. But perhaps the other really differentiating factor of what our initiative has been focusing on not just the hackathon weekend itself, but what happens after the hackathon? How do we take those teams from just an initial idea, initial concept, maybe an initial prototype, to doing something out there? So with that, we've done a series of virtual hackathons over the last 6 months. The first one, major one, public that we were doing was in early April, called Beat the Pandemic, that really gathered participation from 49 states and 96 countries. Each of these large-scale events had around 1,500 participants, 200 to 300 mentors as well. The first one really focused on how to help health systems and protecting vulnerable populations. We then did one focus on the African continent, where we got participation from nearly 44 of the 54 African countries, where over 50% of the participants were from the African continent itself. Again, very similar types of topics that we were hitting on, but it really highlights the importance of the local ecosystem in terms of what the partner. We will be putting with.
Go ahead. I think you're on mute.
Towards this particular hackathon. Then we also ended up doing a datathon that really was leveraged at trying to figure out how to leverage the deluge of data that was coming out at the time around COVID-19 and making sense for some of our policymakers and some of our decision makers and health systems out there. Subsequently, we did a second round of Beat the Pandemic 2. And then at that point, again, similar representation in terms of a global presence, but really now switching with the problems that we were tackling, right? At that point in time, the initial peak that we had seen in New York City and other major areas was starting to drop off. So we were starting to tackle areas of how do we recover, how do we reopen the economy, how do we reopen health systems, and the second part is how to predict and prevent and prepare for future surges within COVID-19. And then we did more recently a couple of events, one that was focused on the Latin America as the COVID-19 was spiking up in Brazil. And again, getting similar response as well, focusing on a number of areas that were similar to some of our other hackathons, but also some new ones where we now also focus on not just healthcare directly, but also those adjacent areas to healthcare as well, such as how to empower the informal economy. The India event was our most recent one that was back in late August, and that was as those the spikes were starting to happen there and the cases of COVID-19 were rising as well. But similarly, both the Latin America event and the India event had over 70 to 80% of the participation from those geographical areas, as well as a global response towards that as well. So, and so really, was going to really quickly highlight a few of the ideas that came out. One of that came out of the early events was a team called Fast Moving Prevention Education, and they were, as you can tell from this Tim's slide, and this was pretty much telltale of every single team that came through our hackathons, really coming together from different time zones, different countries towards this common problem to solve on. But this one, they were focused on how to educate vulnerable populations on prevention measures. And their idea was to try and essentially take these types of simple infograms and overlay on existing products that already had deep penetration, especially in rural or underserved areas, that could easily gain access to sharing that information more widely. The second team was called Standing Pack, that really focused on the issue of now that we had the shortage of N95s, how do we make better use of them? And so they really wanted to figure out how to essentially continue to re-serialize them. But one of the issues, of course, large health systems definitely have access to these large-scale, massive influx of PPE disinfection devices. But if you really go into rural areas, such as Africa or underdeveloped areas, that's really not feasible. And so they wanted to figure out, could you build a portable battery-powered UVC N95 sterilizer? And so this is currently in prototype development at the University of Pennsylvania. And then we had a team called WePoll that was really targeting the shortage of COVID-19 testing. And their value proposition was trying to do pool testing. And this was back in April. So even 1 to 2 months before, this was even on the radar for some of us to consider as an option for doing pool testing in COVID-19. But what they wanted to do was to really apply machine learning AI algorithm to really see, can we do pooling smarter? Up until now, FDA had been approving pooling maybe of 2 samples or 4 samples, but how do we get that to a much higher number? And even and over that 6 months that they've been since their first ideation, they've now fully incorporated, filed provisional patents, actually are this week presenting at the health conference, and are in the final 15 for the startup competition there. So really kind of giving you a scope of all the people that came together as part of this hackathon, and really kind of done it with the hundreds of volunteers that came through of the MIT community and colleagues of the MIT community to really put on these events. So with that, I'll turn it over back to Wen. Thanks.
Sharing about that. That's really great. For all the audience members, if you have questions, feel free to put them in the chat and we'll address them later on in our session. Next, we're going to have Artur present. Feel free to take the floor.
All right, let me try and share my screen. Can you see our website?
Yeah, I can see it. And just a reminder for the audience, double click on the panel if you want to maximize the screen.
All right, so my name is Artur Kiulian. I'm a serial entrepreneur and AI engineer. And I've started Corona Y back in March after the call to action from the White House Technology Office when they organized and released the COVID-19 data set, which was basically a 20,000 scientific articles combined into one data set. And what they were trying to achieve is organize the machine learning community to help medical community with the research and analyzing the vast amount of data that researchers already had on coronavirus, a family of viruses. So as a result, it all started with me just posting on LinkedIn, on Facebook, and letting people know that, hey, we should collaborate, we should jump on this challenge, which was posted on Kaggle.com back then, which is the platform for machine learning competitions owned by Google. And all of a sudden, the first day, I had like 20 people reach out to me willing to collaborate. The second day, we had like 50 people, then 100 people, 200 people. And we became, a community that was highly distributed across the world, across tens of time zones. And we all shared one thing. We wanted to figure out how to help medical community with all the expertise and diverse professional backgrounds that we had. So what happened, and let me know if you're able to see the slides. I have this timeline in here. So what happened, we quickly reached 1,000 members count in just a month. And we got a first line of sponsors, different organizations helping us out on the journey of exploration, how to help the medical community, because the challenge that was posted was very abstract and vague. And we were working with a group of medical professionals ranging from epidemiologists to physicians. and figuring out what specific part of the challenge we can really tackle with the machine learning algorithms, NLP specifically, since the data set was and is all about the actual scientific literature. And as a result, for the first months, we were putting things together to address 4 out of the 10 scientific questions that researchers were interested in exploring, which was what is known about transmission, incubation, and environmental stability, what do we know about COVID-19 risk factors, how geography affects virality, and what do we know about vaccines and therapeutics. As a result, the challenge was split in 2 deadlines. We submitted the first round of algorithms and models to address these questions, and we got a pretty good feedback from research community that this is something that could be helpful and we should build on top of it. Obviously, the complexity of the research is enormous, and we realized that we should try and frame this whole objective into some form of practical solution that can be used by specific subset of researchers. And this is when we started realizing that the actual diversity of different questions is enormous too. And we start realizing that there is an abundance of different personas that we could build technology for, and they all have different needs. And after conversations with researchers from Stanford, from Rockefeller University, from Harvard, we realized that we should focus on epidemiology, infectious epidemiology, and as a subset of research community to address the most pressing challenges that they have on hand. So as a result, we formulated the vision behind the open source artificial intelligence AI-powered literature review tool, which is basically a tool that helps researchers scout through 100,000 scientific papers about coronavirus. That's the abundance of literature that we have on hand right now. And obviously, no researchers is capable of reading or searching through such a vast amount of data. And all of the current platforms that they're using are somewhat limited in how you can do the actual literature review process. There is a PubMed, which is a central kind of like a Google for scientific literature. There's Google Scholar. Obviously, there are more specific tools like Embase by Elsevier, but there's nothing like the platform that is tailored to specific needs and specific extraction of the relevant information out of the scientific literature to help researchers spend less time on finding the relevant literature when the timing is of essence. So as a result, we formulated this vision of the literature review tool. On our website, you can actually click solutions and click on literature review demo. And this is a proof of concept that we have so far on navigating various things that are extracted by the machine learning models out of the Core-19 dataset. So what we're utilizing is the machine learning that classifies, machine learning algorithm that classifies papers into different specific study design types. We're able to classify scientific literature much more granularly than any of the existing search engines. And we're able to extract data that researchers are looking for in terms of the literature review summaries. So we're able to extract sample size, the different attributes that usually are not bubbling up in any types of search engine results. And this way, we're able to retrieve much more relevant results for researchers. And that's how we're decreasing the amount of time that they're spending on analyzing literature. So this is the proof of concept that we have so far. We also started productizing and ideating the actual software product based on this. And this became a flagship initiative of our community. The community overall is comprised out of professionals from different backgrounds, from different areas of expertise. We have medical professionals, we have researchers, we have epidemiologists, we have machine learning specialists, which is actually the biggest chunk of our community, and that's why it's also a little bit challenging to productize the experience, because we have so many talents in terms of the actual artificial intelligence and natural language processing that it's sometimes a little bit hard to put it all together into something that regular humans can navigate. And this is the current challenge that we're experiencing so far. And yeah, that's pretty much the overall outline.
Thanks, Artur, for sharing. Next, we're going to invite Benjamin to speak about his organization.
Hi, so I'm Benjamin Treuhaft, and I'm one of the co-CEOs of Helpful Engineering. Let me see if I can pull up this deck. Can I do this? Can I do this? Oh, hang on here. How's this work? I'm technologically deficient, which is interesting for somebody that works in technology.
There's a at the bottom middle, and then a pop-up, and then in the pop-up, select the middle pane so that you can select which app, like your PowerPoint or your browser, to share.
Let's try this. And there we go. Can you see my PowerPoint?
Yeah, and just a reminder for the audience, you can double click on the PowerPoint to make the screen bigger.
Okay, so Helpful Engineering. We're a global innovation platform of volunteers. We're a not-for-profit that supports this community of more than 18,000 on our Slack, essentially beginning working in regulated industries like healthcare. It began as a COVID response community, started off as 10 people, and within 10, 15 days, we grew to over 15,000. And we had hundreds of projects coming in looking for just to help address the situation that I think that everybody knew was coming. If you remember back to March and April, we saw what was happening in Italy, just the panic out of China and the paralysis, because nobody believed that any of this was going to come to America, except some people did. And they're typically in the sciences at the edge of economics and innovation. And what we saw were all these folks come together to do this work to try to address shortcomings in supply chain that everybody could predict were going to happen, but not really know how to do this. So we had people pouring in, talent pouring in across all domains, not just tech, not just medicine, not just engineering, not just business, all of these domains, without any framework against which to go to work and deliver and perform good work. So we had this enormous period of growth and scale. You try scaling 17,000 people over 3 weeks. And, it's been followed by a longitude of normalization of activities that the not-for-profit that I now lead has engaged in. And we now maintain and grow that community, and we continue to expand our list. So what have we learned from what that experience was and what people need, which is that there's a strong impulse for community-driven innovation. People don't want more of what they perceive doesn't work, whether that's in healthcare, whether that's in technology, whether that's in the products that they need every day. These are all what we would define as systemic frictions and risks. And people want to make things and be empowered to make the solutions that they need for their locality. So what does that look like to us? That looks like somebody, for example, whether they need let's restrict ourselves to medicine. That looks like somebody saying, okay, I need a ventilator. Well, a person in the Western world, their ventilator isn't the same as a ventilator need in Africa. We can afford $35,000 ventilators in the US. We got that price down to about 15 with the Philips deal. But somebody in Africa, or any low middle income country within a geographical region, maybe they, the per capita might be $5,000-$6,000. They're not going to pay $35,000. So how do you get them a ventilator at $20? Hard question, right? Somebody in helpful engineering figured out how to do that. $20, single use, pretty good. But most people, when they go through the process of trying to create something, aren't familiar with actually how to do it. They might have a subspeciality, if you will. They don't know what best product design or engineering practice are, or how to do it. They don't know what regulatory means. People think that's just a bunch of rules. It's not. It's a frame of mind. It's a practice. Solution testing for solutions, how you make it safe, isn't easily accessible for community-driven innovation. It tends to be gated off, incredibly expensive, whether in university labs or third-party independent labs, like Nelson. There's no real centralized repository for validated information, and access to this stuff can be also quite opaque. It's hidden behind complex technical language, the way standards at ISO can be gated off. You have to purchase necessarily to understand what they are. So when people produce solutions and they're really willing to come to the table to do them in a crisis, in a fast way, such that government isn't necessarily willing to do or can't do, or that industry won't do because they wait and see whether or not it's worth it from a market perspective, well, communities will step up and do it. And so what we've designed is a platform that people can come and do that. That's what we've perceived, or what we've learned out of the experience of March and April. So we had all this amazing talent show up, but no way to connect the right talent to the right project in the right place, and no way for the work to hang together. How do you organize a complex development project that needs to address, that a ventilator isn't particularly hard to make, but to make it properly, it requires some infrastructure. And then once you've produced the technology itself, how do you get it out into the world to make it helpful? A good idea, you've probably heard this phrase, a good idea is a dime a dozen, and it is. And even the development of a product is a dime a dozen. How you wrap the whole thing up and actually get it out to somebody that needs to be helpful, that's another thing entirely. As such, what we do as a not-for-profit supporting this community is we support people who, whether an entrepreneur, an engineer, a person from the community, in the world in general, who's identified a problem and wants to address it. We provide a place for them to do it, to learn what they need to do it, to get the tools, the support, the knowledge transfer, the organization. Good ideas rise to the top because people have to defend them. And we create a form and a process for doing that, for describing it, explaining it to others, and making it stronger through collaboration. And as such, as things move through our process, they have a path into commercialization. Now, we have to use that word because that is the mechanism of the market through which a solution gets into the hands of somebody that needs it. And we have to work with that term. I don't like it in this context necessarily, but that's just how it works right now. So what we found is that what we do is assist this really passionate, talented volunteer pool from their needs identification to incept to development, and then ultimately help prepare the projects that are the most successful to get ready to go to market. And so our key assets as such are this large community that's growing still, our ability to source great ideas from everybody. We've had some terrific projects come to us from MIT. We've had some of ours go over to the MIT hackathons. One of ours actually placed in the MIT India hackathon, but we work with other institutions as well and other frameworks. We have some terrific prominent partnerships from everybody from the Department of Commerce and NIST. We've been working with the United Nations, Engineers Without Borders, universities, governments around the world, including the European Union, and industry across all our tool providers, manufacturers around the world. And we have worked internally as a result of the people that have shown up to do this work to produce a really defined development process and support structure such that you could probably produce a class 3 medical device through our open source process right now. We have the tools in place to do such a thing, which is really saying something. That's a life critical thing. So the way this works, somebody comes, make an impact, solve a problem you're passionate about, meet people to network to do it, because the good ideas that are well described attract experienced people, and things happen. We pick projects that are most likely to succeed by virtue of listening to others in the community and provide everything from project management, quality assurance, and regulatory guidance, cooperation with international institutions. We go out and help find funding. We let people know about them. We find people for what they need, and our community is more than willing to transfer knowledge through access to their technical expertise and experience. So that's what we do at Helpful Engineering. In brief, does that cover it?
Thank you, Benjamin. That was great. So I just put up a list of the names of our speakers. Can you? Okay. So give me just to reorganize my screen. Okay, so what we're going to do next is I'm actually going to start with the audience questions first, because I want to make sure we have time to address all the audience questions before the 9:15 or whatever time zone you guys are in. And then afterwards, if anyone in the audience would like to stick around, we're going to continue chatting, because there's actually a whole plethora of questions and topics that all of the panelists and I have prepared. And so we want to make sure that for those of you who are interested in diving deeper, we're going to stick around a little bit past the official end of this session, and then we'll explain what will be happening in the next session. So the first question, I'm actually going to address most of these questions to all of you, all the panelists. So if you'd like to prepare those, we'll start with Freddie, and then the rest can answer for the hackathons or the organizations that you have. They must have produced a lot of ideas and concepts. What will happen to those ideas and concepts that are not going to be prototyped or commercialized?
So all of our hackathons were operated under an open source license. So if the original team doesn't decide to continue on with the idea, it's certainly open to anybody else to sort of pick up the ball from there and move it forward to the next stage. The other part too is, some of our teams may have developed their initial ideas and/or one event, but I think they're still trying to figure out, is that the right local ecosystem to be able to develop that solution? As you can tell from across our different events, there were still a lot of the same issues and problems, but solving that problem in the United States versus, solving it in Africa is going to produce two very different solutions. As part of that. But we at MIT, kind of to the way Benjamin has alluded to as well in his remarks, is that we've been trying to work with as many partners as possible to figure out how to support the teams, how to support those ideas, and to really move them forward as much as we can.
And Benjamin or Artur, would you like to jump in?
I'm happy to. So Helpful is an open source community, and our business model, well, business model. Again, I have to use terminology that, is just what the world works with. So the way we organize projects is very much distributed development in open source. So it's a software model. The idea is we look at projects that we support as ones that can produce a solution that has a reference model, a reference design, reference IP. That's intended to be open source. If we're lucky, that's going to be what, 70% of the solution. All right, at least in terms of what a finished solution is, it's the expensive core part of the thing. All right, what would be a good example of that within Helpful, or at least in terms of, well, we'll park that one for a second, and I'll give some examples of this later on. So the way that we do this in terms of business model is the idea the reference stuff, the distributed part of it is parked in a not-for-profit component, held there, maintained there in the community. And then anybody can pick that up, whether it's the team, volunteer, whatever, and go to market with it. Now they're gonna have to finish it. They're gonna have to do the regulatory approval. They're gonna have to do all the market, the testing, all that kind of validation stuff. That all has to be parked with a business entity of some sort. That's how liability works. That's how business works. We tried to get around it. You can't. There's no way to do it without doing that. It has to be parked with an entity. So we do have models for that. Somebody had asked for that earlier. And somebody else asked if we would be willing to work with emerging markets in Southeast Asia. The answer is emphatically yes. We work with everybody globally. We don't pick favorites. That's not what we're about. What we're about are producing solutions to define problems and making them available. They're not of any use if they're parked or behind some kind of wall.
And then on that question as well.
Yeah, so I would say the same model as Benjamin mentioned. We as Corona-Y, we're actually in the process of receiving the tax exempt status from IRS, which would fully converge into a nonprofit organization status. And the way we treat our business model is through us building on top of the open source technology, absorbing as much as possible in terms of availability of technology on the market, and then making sure that we can create a sustainability layer on top of it, which would be funded and supported by either organizations like governmental agencies that would be utilizing our solution, or research institutions or universities. We are thinking of creating decentralized research organization that can be basically a conduit between different competing sometimes, but nevertheless, the organizations that share the same goal of creating public good in different matters. And obviously the challenge here is that you have to be an entity. And depending on different routes that people would take, you would either go a full nonprofit way and be funded by grants, philanthropy, and donations, or you could possibly create an actual for-profit corporation. And this is also something that we've started considering for the purpose of creating separate projects that have a very definitive need for fundraising and very definitive business model that could be integrated into our open source community. So all of those are very complex matters. There is obviously no recipe that exists on the market for these types of solutions. I believe that we're entering this new stage of, let's say, open source wave that haven't happened before. Obviously, Apache being the kind of the standalone de facto of how open source organizations are driven is a good example of how it was done like 20 years ago. But this model no longer works, and we are on the edge of figuring out how to do it in 2020.
Great, thanks for that. And if you have any other questions or comments, feel free to put it into the chat. And one of the things I noticed as a recurring theme in all the presentations is that their organizations are not just about technology and creating technology as an innovation. It's really about organizing the people, organizing the information and data, having ways to manage the people operationally, collaboratively, and then also the business model and the financial aspects. And I think one of the themes that came up when we were preparing for this panel is, how do you, there's two types of sustainability in my mind. One is, how do you have the organization be sustainable, where the organization is funded or the organization is supported? And then also, how do you have the specific, hackathon or project solutions be sustainable to actually go to market? So I'd like to ask any of you if you have any thoughts about either one of them, if there are any other additional lessons learned, or any aha moments, or what to do, what not to do related to either making a specific solution sustainable or having your organization be sustainable.
You guys want to go first? I'm happy.
I would jump in and start with a big realization that we had somewhere between like months 2, months 3 of our existence, which was the proper utilization of the willingness of people to do voluntary work, because it's easy to fall down into the kind of the illusion of thousands of people and everyone's ready to contribute. But life happens. Some people are ready to contribute for 10 minutes per day. Some people are willing to contribute for three hours a day. And it's a very, very complex equation in terms of balancing the amount of different exciting projects that you could be facilitating and making sure that all of these projects have somewhat internal leadership, the momentum that could push them forward. And this is something that pushed us to conserve resources and try and focus on the flagship initiatives versus going into many directions. Because at the very beginning, CoronaWise started attracting more and more people, and more ideas were started within the community. We had a project that was focused on misinformation, the project that we still have that is focused on the computer vision and the analysis for the acute respiratory disease syndrome. And all of these projects are exciting, and you as a core community member, you want to be a part of all of these initiatives. But the reality is that there's only 24 hours a day, and you have to prioritize certain things, especially if you're dealing with limited resource, limited volunteer time, and obviously no one's paid for it. So you have to balance that fact too. So it's definitely an environment where you have to be more conscious about making sure that the facilitation that you're creating happens in the places where people are the most motivated to do certain work, and there's the most ability to actually accomplish these tasks. And the more granular, the more kind of chunked out the tasks are, the higher probability of success for those.
You want to share your take on this?
Well, there's a lot to cover very quickly, I think, between your statement about your initial premise or for the conversation, and then to speak to a few things and to reinforce a few things Artur said. So the first thing is about the organization of information and the value of that. So that is one of the things that we organizationally identified in April, is that the way that the information is organized. What does that mean in the context of medical? We decided that what that meant in the context of medical is that if you're going to work to try to solve something in the domain, that means you have to concentrate on regulatory. I grew up with a mother who was a research scientist who I'm embarrassed to say is on this call. So she's watching me do this and I'm turning red. But my mom taught me a bunch of really important lessons. I grew up in a research laboratory, and when she went into pharma in the 80s as a doing drug development and regulatory. Brought into the market when FC cures. So take a bow, Mom. But one of the things I remember that she told me at the time that I thought was really very important and very significant was she said regulatory leads a company. All right. And I didn't really know what that meant as a young kid, but I've learned a lot about what it really means. And what it means is, at least in drug development, but this is also true for medical product development, what are you trying to do? How are you trying to do it? How do you prove that it is effective and safe? All right. So we oriented around that. We oriented around building out a product development pipeline and organizing our information in such a way that, oh, there she is. She just showed up. She missed me calling her out. How do you do all of that in such a way that an idea produced early on in the community represents the lowest risk and the highest probability of becoming successful? Well, if it can't get through FDA or it can't get NEC stamp, it goes in the garbage. It's not useful. This does not matter whether this is a device or software. I don't care what. If it is not describable, if it is not understandable, if it is not documented, if it is not defendable, if it can't get a 510K or prove that it is as such, robust, it doesn't matter. The best ideas in the world, like if people can't understand them, they're not useful. And so that's how we've organized information. In terms of stability, sustainability, when you start talking about the not-for-profit marketplace or how you get support, you're talking about $700 billion a year floating around in the United States. Most of that is provided through individual contributions, somewhere around 50-60 through corporate contributions, and a little bit less at the some institutional level. So most of that money comes from solicited donations from people that think that the thing matters. In terms of how do you get that? Well, initially you got to go out and get that contribution, to get yourself off the ground from organizational support grants. But then as you produce solutions, you have to package them and produce them in a sustainable way. We've gone through some early experiments with incubating other not-for-profits, and we've come to the conclusion that incubating a not-for-profit doesn't work because there's not a good mechanism for it to go on to be sustainable, because it's going to have to rely on donations and support and and other organizational support grants, and that's tricky. You're fighting with a lot of other not-for-profits for those dollars. As such, there has to be a sustainable business mechanism.
Time check. We have 2 more minutes before the 15-minute mark when Artur has to leave. And then some of us are going to be sticking around for another 15 minutes or so to continue the conversation. So before Artur leaves, I just wanted to give you an opportunity to just share if there are any other comments that you wanted to share, or if you want to comment on the question about project management, just so everyone can hear about it.
Yeah, so Alan, thanks for asking. The kind of the traditional technical project management aspect of it. And obviously, I come from a background where this is the standard practice to involve the technical project manager, have a product manager, and facilitate all of these processes using Trello, using Jira, and all the traditional tools. Unfortunately, in the very early kind of months of our organization, that wasn't met with kind of like, it wasn't really accepted because people came in this rush of creative freedom, and everyone was experimenting, toying around, tinkering, and having a manager was not a feeling that people wanted to experience. And that's why we started renaming managers into coordinators, which was received way better. So just an example how simple a change in vocabulary can bring organizational different treatment of the same processes being applied.
Thank you, Artur. Thanks for joining. we'll say goodbye to Arthur, but before he goes, if anyone's interested in his organization, check out the coronawhy.org website. And then next, Freddie's going to share his thoughts on any of the topics we've touched upon so far, or if you have any additional topics you'd like to bring up. And then we'll move to, after Freddie, then we'll go back into the Q&A, the questions that are in the chat. Thanks.
And thanks, Lynn. Just to hit on some of the topics or questions that you brought up before about sustainability of these types of initiatives. I mean, that's probably one of the most common things that we get asked about, especially about hackathons. Is, yeah, it's great you bring people together as a weekend, but what really happens? What's the actual impact as well? And I think from the project and the idea perspective, we came into this process, especially through MIT Hacking Medicine, that it's not purely about the venture itself or the idea itself that we're generating. I think, as I alluded to in my earlier remarks, it's creation of a community, creation and empowerment of people who maybe prior to this opportunity didn't even think about the innovation space, didn't even think about going out and doing startups on their own. And so now essentially giving them the education, the toolkit to think about problem solving and to problem solve in healthcare, which is one of the most complex places to be doing it, right? Because everybody that's, the person that's paying for the solution, the person that's using the solution, the person that is prescribing the solution are three different entities. And so for us, it's really our mentality that anyone can make a difference in the healthcare innovation space. You bring different perspective, you bring your own patient experiences to the table, your caregiver experience to the table, you bring experiences from the engineering side, from the business side into it. And so all those components need to be there and have a big value proposition in that process. From the organizational standpoint of hacking medicine or the COVID-19 challenge and how to make that sustainable, we've always been a completely volunteer organization that's been completely financially supported through typical sponsorship of our hackathon events as well. So although it's probably not necessarily the best business model out there, we seem to have been doing fine in that process. I mean, we've been lucky as well that our methodology has proven true. I mean, we've had companies, for example, like PillPack that was formed out of our very first hackathon that MIT Hacking Medicine did, and as some of you may or may not know, it was acquired by Amazon a couple of years ago for almost $1 billion. And so that that's we're just now of some of those companies from the earlier days of hacking medicine. And so I think those companies continue to essentially give validation to our process and to our community as well. And I think what's been interesting about this whole process within the context of COVID is, at least for us, we usually our hackathon planning takes 3 months, 4 months to do in a live venue and so on, and to been able to mobilize not just our community, but the global community within a matter of 2 to 3 weeks. That's literally the amount of time it took from day one, us deciding we're going to do that virtual hackathon, to the hackathon weekend itself, has been really amazing. And I think part of it is having that infrastructure in place already, that we already knew what needed to be done. But I think the biggest part was that for once in our society, we've had a single unifying goal and cause that all of us gravitate towards too, and to be able to provide that channel for people who wanted to do something towards COVID-19, connecting them with the people who had the issues within COVID-19 to accelerate that innovation process was really what made this highly successful.
And I was thinking about one of the questions from Nardo Manoloto, and I'll address it to both of you, in terms of, does your organization help to define the business models and the production of the products? I mean, what is your role in the go-to-market process? I know each of you had touched upon it briefly. If you could just elaborate on that and really talk about the concrete logistics of going from the idea to actually making it real in the world.
So, part of our hackathons, we actually want people to develop that go-to-market strategy during the hackathon as well. So for us, the final presentation we always ask for is, it's a 3-minute pitch presentation, I know very short, and they have a lot to pack into that, but we basically say, a minute of it is telling us about the problem, the impact of it, the market landscape research, 1 minute on the actual innovation or the solution that you're currently developing or proposing to develop. But then the other minute is about that, what's the implementation plan? What are you, how are you doing over the next 6 to 12 months to make this a reality? And then ultimately, what's the potential business plan? And that's, how will it pay for itself? And that's what I meant when I talked about the business viability and feasibility is, think about how is this thing going to be self-sustaining? It can be a nonprofit, but it has to somehow be financially self-sustaining as well downstream.
So this is a big part of what we think about and what we organize against. And what we've decided to do, the way we've decided to organize is that, again, we park so much of the development. We encourage the projects and we work with the projects to think about what that is going to be with the knowledge that actually that's not done in the not-for-profit. We set up the project in such a way that, and we try to coordinate things in such a way that it will work with a go-to-market entity. Helpful's in the process of assembling a go-to-market entity to facilitate this. That will be one possible path, and that's part of our sustainability model for the not-for-profit that supports the community. Because look, I mean, to provide somebody the toolkit as such as we do to actually go to market, it's $2,000 or $3,000 per user per month right now. I mean, it's expensive. So making things is expensive, and we have to. It's got to get paid for somehow. So that is a big part of what we do. And we're very fortunate that part of our community and the way that we work is to bring together business talent and capital right at idea incept and have them work together, not just in the development of the reference IP, but then once the IP ideation, the creation starts, you're at your alpha beta phase, your MVP, if you will, of like what the open source core reference idea should be. And then that's going to get marched across to jurisdiction. Our model is very much, we want to see local businesses, local implementations across different jurisdictions because we believe in economic velocity. We don't want any more big silos. We identified that as a systemic risk. That's a bad model for a bunch of reasons. So, this gets into some deeper rabbit hole stuff about other things that we've figured out that we have to tackle. And that would be the kind of thing that we work on with the Department of Commerce in this. We're designing an agile supply chain with them. But that is very much what this is designed to address. Right now, it takes 18, 24 months to bring something or to manufacture something. Well, if you have the idea ready, if you have the IP ready, if you have the solution ready, why can't we do that in a week? Actually, you can if you're organized.
Thanks for that. And so that brings me to one of the questions that I've been wondering about, and I believe Freddie briefly touched upon it, which is how does your organization help or deal with intellectual property? I know several of you mentioned your organizations are open source based. Is that a barrier to patents? Is that a barrier to getting VC funding? What are your thoughts about that?
So out of our events, the work product during the hackathon event is under the open source that further gets developed post that weekend. Obviously goes into normal IP protection for those teams because it is that fine balance to play. And I think for us, it was striking that balance because we were working with partners on how do you most accelerate the ideation process. And many of our partners were just essentially had their hands tied that, if they were going to co-develop something with an entity and if it was going to take weeks or months to go through all the legal components of it, of protection and rights and so on, that it would make it a lot more challenging to quickly accelerate the ideation and adoption of some of these ideas within their respective organizations. So that was kind of the framework to provide that balance. And that way, essentially, the continuing teams essentially had that partnership with those partners to further go develop if they wanted to, but then that would lead into those more IP protected type of work.
Ready? Welcome, Todd. Todd is an amazing organizer for this conference. We're going to be doing about 5 more minutes of Q&A, and then Todd's going to be explaining the next session after that. So there's a fascinating question from Nardo Manalotto about, do you think the current pandemic is creating a new industry? Do you think that there's a pandemic industry, and is it here to stay? And if so, what infrastructure is needed to develop and support this new industry?
Well, I'll follow up. I'm sorry. I was going to say, I'll follow up very quickly on support of what Freddie said, which is that what we've observed is that, the advantage to going open source with reference or core IP is obviously that you get rid of all the garbage intellectual property restrictions that normally burden companies in silos, and you shift this enormous sunk development cost that you would normally have or spend a lot of time and money defending into a domain where it becomes about the packaging and the delivery and the service around it. And as such, it becomes a better experience for the consumer, and it represents less risk all the way down the line for everybody. Now, what we've discovered about the way current open source licenses work is that they're not really up to date, and as such, right now we work in part under the some of the MIT licenses, and we work under the CERN licenses. We're very strong believers in the model, but we're working to develop our own community license that's a little more up to date for actual physical product, because even the CERN licenses, which are probably the most aggressive, still represent a bunch of political realities that we'd prefer to dispense with. So we're doing that, and we have the support of the guy who wrote those licenses writing ours. So that's why we're out on intellectual property. In terms of the question of, is there a new industry here? Is it here to stay, and what has to be developed? That's exactly what we're building, our tools and a place where anybody, the way I like to put it in a really reductionist kind of way, is where anybody can come to, who needs to learn how to grow a tomato. We can teach you how to do it, to grow a good one, and then sell the tomato so you can make another one. So this is basic Adam Smith stuff, right? But that's actually really important, because we've spent so much time over the last 30, 40 years, and particularly in thanks to devices like this, in which produce what? Convenience, right? And the more convenient things are, and the less you think about them, the more you outsource your decision-making process and your training to make important decisions when they matter. You outsource a whole bunch of agency. So what we're trying to do is create a way to teach people how to take a chunk of that back and make the things that they need themselves, instead of waiting for other people to get around to doing it, because it's clear big business isn't going to do it fast enough when we need it.
Thank you.
I think just to piggyback on that really quickly, in terms of whether a pandemic's creating a new industry, I think it's an interesting question, because for me, it's more that the pandemic is creating new opportunities. It's creating us a new environment in which we can do much more rapid and agile innovation development, whether that's from an open source perspective or not. But I think it's essentially allowing us to reimagine how we currently do things. Whether, I don't know if the question was specifically about like rapid response, at least the way we've targeted the work with and advice with all of our teams and projects has been, use the pandemic as an opportunity, because a lot of the barriers that were in place before now no longer are there. The pain points are much higher in a lot of instances, and so the activation and energy for you to be able to have certain conversations, to test and validate your ideas, is much lower than it used to be. So take advantage of that. But we do highly encourage people to also be thinking about the post-COVID, pivot in your building, because we hope that 6 months or 12 months from now, COVID won't be as a mainstay of our day-to-day lives anymore. But it's hopefully definitely not going to be the case in 5 years or 10 years from now. And so for us, thinking about getting the people to think about that is really important, because we've even had some teams that, who started with one thing at the very beginning of the pandemic, for example, PPE shortages and supply, who were going after, how do you manufacture and source this new PPE? And then when that need and problem kind of went away, so did their company, right, essentially, or so did their idea. And so we've really tried hard to get those people to think in both of those aspects and to take advantage of both.
Yeah, I think you're so correct in terms of, really thinking about not just what is the current solution, but how does this solution morph or evolve or grow or adapt after COVID is fixed or improved. And I've been on a lot of calls with different healthcare organizations, with investors, and that's the question they're always asking. They're always saying, like, this widget is supposed to solve this particular problem this month or this year, but then once there's a vaccine or once there's, a better mask, like how can this be repurposed or pivoted or reused to solve a bigger problem? So I know Freddie has to go soon, so just wanted to give you a chance to see if you have any last thoughts, or if you wanted to address the question about how you rank the impact of projects. I'll leave it up to you.
So very quickly, well, first of all, thank you to Nguyen for moderating this session. Thank you to Todd for inviting me on this session, of course, working with us over the past year as well. Let's see, the question about ranking the impact of innovations. It's a really hard question in the sense that, even for us, even though if we have quote unquote winners out of our hackathons and so on, I think the way we've quantified impact is you can do it two ways, right? You either provide a huge delta to a small number of population or people that it's affecting, or you're providing an incremental delta, but across a much larger population of people that it's affecting, is one way to think about that process. But for us, especially coming straight out of the hackathon weekend, there's been no correlation about who wins at our hackathons versus their long-term trajectory and viability as a team, as a company, or even as a product itself. It's just a bit too early. So trying to really nurture the community as much as we can until probably more in the 3 to 6 month timeframe post hackathon is when we start seeing, really seeing that pivot towards sort of a more funneling process to be able to see who has the most potential. But it's such multifactorial. What has high impact, again, like, here in Massachusetts versus, in Texas is going to be very different, or in Africa is going to be very different. So I think that's a challenging question to directly address. But thank you again, Nguyen and Todd, for having me here.
Thank you for being here.
Best of luck with the rest of that day.
Yeah, thanks for sharing about your organization. So what I'm going to do next is I'm actually just going to briefly comment on some of the chat topics, just so that for those of you who are joining in just through audio, or if you're watching this video later, I just want to make sure that you benefit from some of the chat topics. And then right after that, I'll ask Benjamin to just make any closing remarks if he has any. And then Todd's going to be introducing the next session. So I'm just going to click the chat. Just give me 1 second. Basically, so there was a question about, for the volunteers onto Artur's AI/ML platform, were most of the contributors from the AI/ML community. And he had mentioned that many of them are from the AI/ML community, but they lack traditional project management skills and processes, so that was a big challenge. And then there was another question about, let's see. So there was another question about, have there been any like AI products that have come out that have been interesting from Artur's projects? And that's a common question. And while they're not really building a specific product to produce insights, it's a complex matter and it will affect the real lives of people. So they're trying to empower the epidemiologists to produce these insights and make their lives easier. And then there was a question about, let's see, we talked about those verbally. Give me 1 second. Let's see, just skimming through. I think we covered most of the things. There was a mention from Benjamin about how helpful engineering pursues something in parallel, where teams make their own projections, while helpful also considers, what is their level of impact. And so the teams are asked what's the level of impact, as well as the helpful leadership gets to help define that as well. So, and there's one more comment from John Stacks, which he's mentioning about the importance of genomics, and that now is the ideal time to really think about, as we think about the COVID-19 pandemic, and in parallel think about genomics and the data pipeline that can support genomics. So with that, I'd like to turn it over to Benjamin, just if you have any closing thoughts.
So I'd like to make, I think, one around the idea about what sustainability looks like when we're talking about sustainable solutions, and how things, this again speaks to, this ongoing topic of organization of information, which in a certain respect is also what, in some respects, what John is talking about. Let me see if I can string all this together. So the way that I would look at this from what I do, which is I'm what I would call an assembler. All right. I'm not a technologist particularly. I understand technology pretty well, but what I do is find parts and put them together in logical ways. All right. That's my job. That's what I do. So in terms of sustainability, when we take an idea, the logical object of a solution with its description, its defense, its regulatory, it's all that stuff. Okay, that's all packaged up. And then we package it with the business components and what that's all supposed to look like. And then we find, okay, this was made at this time for this solution, and now the problem's over, and okay, we don't need it anymore. All right, so there goes the business, it evaporates, right? So that was this thing that we were presented with. Okay, what does that look like? Well, that just means we have to do some abstraction here and find repurposing, because the model you were describing is, I think, a very big part of why the US government's SBIR grant processes, whether it's from out of the NIH or through small business, all of that process, so much of it fails. That's what you call the valley of death between the innovation and market. Okay, so if we take this a step further, what does that really mean? It actually just means it's being coordinated wrong. Here's an example. In the early days of the pandemic, everybody thought the shortage was going to be in ventilators. Well, sure enough, there's some problem with that. We shipped a bunch overseas. There were 80,000 in the stockpile. A good portion of those were kept in bad storage. They went in the garbage. They're also old. They hadn't been maintained, blah, 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 blah. Okay, so we spent a bunch of money, $600 million, made 100,000 ventilators. Turns out there's an extra 100,000 laying around. So now we've got there's something about there's about 180,000 ventilators floating around the US economy that don't have a home. Okay, they're going to be dead in 3 years. They're useless. So we just, okay, bad allocation, right? Left hand not knowing what the right hand's doing. But here's the problem, that none of them can end up in a hospital system anyway. In healthcare, generally speaking, for every dollar of development put in to a device or software solution, a company expects to return 10,000. That's the metric. All right. I get this out of the leaders of hospital systems. I'm not making this up. All right. Then the hospital system must spend somewhere between $5 and $10 for every dollar of solution that they purchase. All right. You do the math. It's an awesome number. Big, huge number. So that's kind of what I would define as a big friction or risk. We make the excuse and the argument, oh, well, you have to make that kind of multiple in order to pay for everything that fails. Well, why does so much fail?
Yes, I was just curious if you have your last thoughts so that we can turn it over to Todd.
Well, the point that I'm trying to make is that if you want to take that solution and actually then get it to a sustainable point, the idea, for example, around a ventilator would be that you take Kaiser and you take Sinai and NYU Langone, and you take the VA and you sit them down at a table and you say, what are the 5 things in your hospital that you guys all use? Because it's all the same thing, and there's been no innovation in your patient support platforms for 10 or 15 years. There's just been repurchasing of the same stuff from different vendors across those metrics. So how do we go down to your engineering department and your actual use needs, build you the same reference IP and the implementations that you need, and drop that cost, that multiple, to maybe 1 in 1,000. That's it. That's what sustainability looks like.
So it makes a lot of sense to, the economies of scale, partnering with more organizations that bear the cost and the risk of developing new solutions and try to really tackle the high impact problems that are out there. And so
the way I would put it is the coordination of risk. Yeah, the coordination of the need but also the collection of need and incorporating it in the solution at incept. It's not so much that this stuff costs so much to develop. We know how to make a ventilator. The question is that can everybody use roughly or have that their use case reflected in the same product? And then is there an entity that can make it that doesn't have to extract 10,001 because they're not, and also more than that, because they're not accommodating for the engineering departments of the respective systems or users.
Great. Well, thanks for your insights. It's, you've definitely thought a lot about this important challenge. And I'd like to thank all of our audience for being with us today. It's been a great discussion. And also want to thank Todd again for organizing. I'm going to post into the chat our various LinkedIn websites, just so if you want to keep in touch, feel free to contact us there. And then now I'm going to turn it over to Todd for him to explain the next session. Thank you.
Thank you for having me. Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you, guys. Thank you, everyone. That was an amazing session. And so I think what's best next is you can see on the left-hand side, there's a networking button that says now. And what we can do is have these quick round, quick sessions. It's like a chat roulette where we can quickly meet each other for 3 minutes or 10 minutes. And so if everyone gets to go into the networking section, we can do that. And then following that, there's gonna be an amazing panel discussion on behavioral health. And so we'll hopefully see you soon in the networking, but definitely we'll see you back in sessions at 10:15. So see you soon, everyone. Thank you.